Welcome to Life by Design for Chiropractors, episode 26.
Welcome to Life by Design, the podcast for chiropractors. Here's your host, Dr. Jamie Richards.
Welcome to Life by Design for Chiropractors, the voice of reason in chiropractic. I'm your host, Dr. Jamie Richards, and on today's episode, I'm flying solo, so no intro today. We're going to jump right into it. Today's topic is feedback cycles, and I don't know if you even know what those are, if you do them in your practice, if you're doing them well, if you're having a difficult time with them. Today, we're going to cover all of those and more, making sure that you understand what they are, how to do them, and what some of the key points are. In fact, I'm going to cover 7 key points really as to why feedback cycles are so important to have in your practice and to have as a system that's consistent, that is habitual, that is just built in and part of your practice model. So what's a feedback cycle? It really is an opportunity to communicate with people in your practice in some way, shape, or form. So there's lots of ways that could fall into this category. The most common ones are going to be your examination and your examination follow-up opportunities. Most doctors that I see in our coaching, consulting, or people who send me questions, many of the people who listen to the show, and me included up until 5 or 6 years ago, my idea of a feedback cycle was, I check you every time, I make corrections every time. If you're not subluxated, I tell you every time that you're not subluxated. So, falling back into the Reggie Gold model where, once I describe for you on the first day what this is, if you don't buy that hook, line, and sinker and understand the basic idea, there's really no reason for me to continue to come back and retest and remeasure, because you should be getting checked on a regular basis for subluxation simply because you're better off not subluxated. Now, while all of that is entirely true, having a feedback cycle has some incredible value. And I can say, since I've reintroduced those in my practice after the last 5 or 6 years, it really has been a huge blessing in the sense that, it's led to so much positive growth in my practice, not just in numbers and revenue and profits, but in terms of the development of the people in my practice. So, I really think that having a feedback cycle as part of your system is it really is one of those top 4 or 5 things that needs to be put in place, from a good day 1, 2, a great conversation at the end of the first stage of care, what we call the second buying decision. But along the way, you need to have these feedback cycles. And really, if you're looking at building a long-term retention-based practice, one where people not only start and then they stay, but then they stay for a very, very, very long time. If you're going to be building that type of practice, then you need to have some type of feedback for your practice members. I think part of it is psychological. The part of the buying decision for this person is, once they've bought you or bought your service, that doesn't mean that they've made the decision that they're going to buy this continuously for the rest of their life. So there needs to be the continued development and the understanding of your patients to really know why they're making that decision for themselves or their family. I always found it odd, and maybe even nothing worse than talking to someone who maybe had been at a previous chiropractic office, possibly even a great chiropractic office, and they've had some original testing. And I always ask them, what was the next set of tests that you had? When did you have those? What they'd look like? What were the results? And too often, people don't have them. So they'll use objective testing on the front end as part of a sales process, and use that to slide them in the door and to start the process of chiropractic care. But then they're not retesting, they're not re-examining, they're not using those in an ongoing way for lots of reasons. I think that part of the reason docs don't do or have a feedback cycle is time. So I think there's a legitimate concern as your practice grows, or the days that you're open isn't wide enough for you to have regular times for a growing practice. I think there's ways around that, and I don't think it's a good reason, but I understand that can be a reason for some people to go through that process and really remove feedback cycles from their practice or never have had them. I think the more common one, though, is fear. I think that lots of doctors are afraid of what the tests are going to look like. They're not quite sure how to interpret them, to communicate them. And, without that understanding on, day 1 or 2, it's very much based on, okay, I see color on your EMG, so that means there's a problem. But there's not a real understanding by the doctor of what that problem is, or how that should change over a period of checkups and corrections, how to explain that to somebody. So you just toss it and you say, forget about it. I know for me, there was, early in practice, I had thermography. One, I didn't know how to communicate it. That was its own separate issue. Two, I really didn't want to continue to pay for it because I didn't see the value in having it integrated into my practice. So I let it go. And then, as I said, 4 or 5 years after that, I came back and reintroduced it. And now we've been using all different objective tests in our practice, from EMG and thermography studies, stress adaptability examinations, advanced palpation examinations, cerebellar testing, structural pictures. So there's lots of different things that we use in our practice to form our comprehensive biostructural examination. So whatever you're using, it doesn't really matter as long as you feel like it's giving you information, as long as it has, a level of objectivity to it, and you have a way of communicating that and demonstrating it to people. So probably part of a different podcast and talking about how to set up your examination room, how to communicate an examination or the follow-up from an examination. Today, I really want to focus on why do it in the first place? What's the selling features here on why you would have feedback cycles, and what are the benefits to you and what are the benefits to your patients? So, as I mentioned, there's really different types of feedback cycles. They can be anything from a progress examination to a comparative re-examination. Depending on how you have your system set up, you could have an annual re-examination and feedback, or you could just have the end of a stage of care and have the examination and whatever necessary feedback is used there. So what are the objectives of the feedback cycles and the examinations? I think they're different. I think that the progress examination and comparative examinations, or the progress examination and your annual or end of stage of care examinations and the follow-up for those, is going to be very different. For us, what we advise is the progress examination is more of a check-in than anything else. It's, a meeting, really, if you will, to simply say in a very short period of time, you're on track, everything is moving, just as we expected it to, and we're going in the right direction. Let's stay right on course with what we decided. So at progress examinations, we don't advise that you're making new decisions about care, new financial decisions. That's only going to happen at a comparative re-examination and the follow-up that comes along with that. The other nice thing about the progress examinations is that you can also use the progress examinations and the follow-up for those as an opportunity to, continue to develop people in your practice. So for us, it's, we have a conversation about eat, move, or think by design. Very briefly, have they implemented it? What's the big change they've made? What are they focusing on next? So we have that timed out in an organized fashion, so we know, hey, today's progress examination 1. On the progress examination 1 follow-up, there's a very specific conversation that we're going to have with people. And the same with progress examination number 2, and all the way through the different steps leading up into the comparative re-examination. And then the big conversation, or what we call the second buying decision, which really I think is the most important visit in your entire practice. It's not day 1, it's not day 2, it's not the examinations themselves. It really is the conversation that happens at the end of the stage of care, specifically the first stage of care, and then the conversation that you have that moves them into their next stage of care. As we've talked about many, many times, when people make that second buying decision, there's a much greater possibility that they're becoming a lifetime patient or a lifetime practice member, versus when they make that first buying decision. That doesn't mean they're going to stay. It doesn't mean that you're going to be leading them down your funnel and stockpiling them in your practice. It means they're starting for now. We'll revisit this at the end of this stage of care, and then we'll have a new conversation, which is that, second buying decision that we keep discussing. Why is a feedback cycle in general, why is it important? So I think there's 7 things. There's probably more, but these are going to cover the vast majority of the concepts around why doing this is so important. And I will say, if you're not doing this, if you don't have a feedback cycle built in, I think it's something you really need to visit. You need to take a look and audit your current systems. And if it's not there, here's the opportunity to put that in. Use some of the principles we're going to talk about today and, start to come up with your own system. If you have any questions or you just want feedback on what you're doing now, then just shoot me a message, jamie@lifebydesign.com. And I'll go ahead and take a look, and I'll reply back to you, let you know what I think, and hopefully help you get going in the right direction. So what's the first one? No specific order, but this first one is extremely important. We've started to encourage you, and it's become a central part of this podcast, to create a checkup based practice. And it sounds weird and probably a little bit odd that you have to talk about that in the profession, because what's the opposite of that? Well, it's a therapeutic practice. It's a practice that is, not built on checking the spine, but simply adjusting the spine for no particular reason. People say, well, I go and get adjusted. Yeah, but that's not the point. The point is to go and get checked to see if you require an adjustment or a correction. And, you might think that's semantics, and in a sense it is semantics, but that's what drives your practice. And, you're using your language and your lexicon to drive the psychology of the patients who are moving through your process. So if people continue to think they're coming to get adjusted, you can see where this goes. When somebody's feeling bad, I need to go get adjusted. When somebody has a headache, they need to go get adjusted. When somebody has a fever, oh, I need to go get adjusted. But what happens when you have that person come in and you adjust them and their fever doesn't go down, or their headache doesn't go away, or their problem that they thought they were coming to get adjusted for doesn't change? Now you're in trouble. Now you're going down a whole different path, having a very difficult conversation. And at that point, it's very difficult to get people to understand what you should have had them understand before you ever started. So part of this is having feedback cycles. And what you're doing is you're reestablishing what you've come to the agreement on at the first day 1 and day 2 conversations. You've talked to them about the idea of getting checked for core problems with their spine and nervous system, that these core problems could be affecting their body in a way that brought them into your practice, but more likely they could be affecting you in ways that you have no idea about. And, you're opening up this door long term for them to understand that getting checked is extremely important. At the same time, you're still keeping them at least somewhat attached, or at least giving them the hope that their current core problem could be a contributing factor to what brought them into the practice. But if all of a sudden at your feedback cycles, you stop that language and you stop that lexicon, then you stop that thread that's running through your practice. People, they hear what you're saying on the front end, but if you don't continue over and over to repeat consistently what it is you're trying to get them to understand, then there's a very good chance that they're just going to fall back into the old pattern. So, if you're trying to create a checkup-based practice, which is what we advise, having a feedback cycle is probably the central key component to helping people understand that. Because when they come in and you have these feedback cycles or these examinations scheduled for them and follow-up visits scheduled for them, they start to develop the understanding that this must be important. Versus, you just throw them in, mishmash, oh, we have time today, let's go in, let's do some tests. It's why I really advise that you don't call them scans or downplay with your language any of the testing protocols that you do, but you upgrade what you're doing and start to develop it as part of your proprietary system. We should be legitimizing chiropractic, not, lowering it so people, quote unquote, can understand it. Scans means nothing to people. It's a throwaway word. And there's lots of those that you're currently using in your practice. We want you to swap it and basically switch that and start to legitimize the language that you're using to help people really grasp that what you're doing is important. The second component here and why it's important is it helps manage expectations. Imagine you set somebody up on a care program that's 36 visits and you check and correct them over a 36 visit period, but you've never stopped to have anything more than the 2-minute conversation that you have at the tables. I'm not suggesting you need to spend excessive amounts of time with people, and done right and having a curriculum that people get in an automated way through, say, an email series or other types of curriculums that you could build, a newsletter, whatever it is. There's lots of ways to develop people. But, from a perspective of a buyer, people are getting to the point where, if they're just seeing you for 2 minutes every single time for 5 years, at some point, they're really going to start to ask themselves, one, am I getting the result that I wanted? Because maybe they're not feeling different, but there's major objective changes that you haven't measured for. And two, anybody in their right mind is going to start to ask, is this something I want to continue to invest my money into? Am I getting the result? Is this worth it to me? So, having these opportunities to follow up with people is a chance to manage expectations. You don't want to get too far down the path with somebody thinking in their mind, this isn't working or this isn't working for me. One of the things we do on our examination forums that I find extremely valuable is we put at the bottom, do you have any questions for your doctor? And it allows them to voice any concerns or thoughts before I ever get to the follow-up. The last thing you want to do is show up at a follow-up examination or a follow-up visit from an examination and have this person blindside you with a question. We covered the questions that don't haunt you, or the questions that haunt you on a previous episode. Go back and listen to that. But the key is you don't want that question to show up while you're walking into a room. You want to know what that question is in advance. You want to know where you're planning on taking that conversation, any pertinent information that you need to know. You want to have that in advance. So number 2 is it helps you manage expectations. Number 3, we've touched on this a bit, but it helps you identify where a patient is at in their development and their understanding. I love to know and have my finger on the pulse of the people that I'm taking care of. Does this person understand why they're coming? Does this person having a challenge grasping the core problem collateral damage concept? Do they still think that I'm treating a specific condition? If they do, what's a new strategy that I can use to help this person understand the process better? If you start to take the clinical aspect of what you're doing and really start to embed it into the culture in your practice, you can start to become a really great doctor, a great clinician, and a really great entrepreneur and marketer and salesperson, because you're starting to understand where people are at psychologically. And you're not just, blasting them with scripts. You're really starting to guide them through a process that has a framework to it, but you use your skills and, the art of communication to figure out where they're at and where they need to go and how you need to bridge the gap. So, these follow-up visits are opportunities to do that. They're a chance to really see, does this person really get what's going on, or am I going to have a problem here when I get to the end of this first stage of care? So another thing we do on our feedback forms is we'll pop a couple questions in there, about the nervous system or about subluxation, very basic things that they would have to know in order to graduate at the end of XYZ stage of care. And then, isn't that really your curriculum? We talked about this on our curriculum episode. This is the idea, is you need to figure out, start with the end in mind. Where do you want them to get to? What do they need to understand in order to graduate and to move forward? And then reverse engineer that. So those are some of the questions that we put on the actual examination forms. So again, I can see where they're at. Are they understanding why they're coming? Is there a disconnect between what we're doing and what they think that I'm doing? I need to address that now. I don't want to have to address that in that second buying decision conversation at the end of a stage of care. I want to know when I walk into that visit or an annual review, I want to know that that person's entirely on board, or at least they understand enough to move into the next stage of care. Number 4, it addresses this, I think it's just a human need for connection. And sure, we can have the debate and the discussion about, how long do people need to spend with a doctor in order to feel like there's a connection. And definitely, you can improve your skills around this, and you can get really, really good at connecting with people in a very short period of time. So I'm not suggesting it needs to be 10 or 20 minutes at your visits. That said, people's mindset around healthcare is that my doctor doesn't spend a lot of time with me. So they're already cynical about it. It's already on their radar. And if you continue to repeat that cycle and play into that, so, a 90-second visit, every visit for 5 years, they're going to start to think the same way, and they're going to lump you into that same category. And that's not to say you're not delivering great care. It's not to say you're not a great corrective doctor. It's just to say that that's where people are at. And so some people are going to need that more than others, but having this built in as a system allows you to continue the relationship building process. And as we all know, a retention-based practice is as much built on great systems and, delivering a great product as it is on building great relationships. And that's one of the upsides. Also, one of the downsides of a practice in chiropractic is that many of the business models are built on the people who are delivering the service. So there is ways around that, something we can talk about on a future podcast, and something that we have to address in our practice as we add associates, and at some of the other Life by Design office with associates, making sure that it's a business that's built on, the product, the service, and that, that relationship building happens through other avenues. But this is one of the ones that if you're running the show and you're delivering the service, having a feedback cycle is a wonderful way to continue the relationship building process. Number 5, it keeps them looking ahead. People love the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. If you're not the next thing, then something else is going to be the next thing. So having, these examinations on an ongoing basis and then a follow-up visit allows you a chance to keep them moving forward. Okay. And as you're developing their understanding, not only are they moving forward, but they're looking forward. I've had lots of people, ask me, when are my examinations? When do we get to see my new tests? As we set new goals for next year, people are excited about next year's tests. So you can really start to develop this culture around getting tested. People really love that idea. Number 6, it's a great opportunity for goal setting, right? It's a great opportunity to guide the process. In a Life by Design office, we use Eat, Move, and Think by Design to essentially move people into some of the other factors that need to be addressed in order to support the function of their spine and nervous system. Not as a, here's some nutrition stuff and here's some exercise things. Yes, we cover lifestyle, but lifestyle, in the context of developing the brain-body connection, in supporting the corrective care, in supporting the optimization process of the brain-body connection to the spine and nervous system. So at these visits, at these follow-up visits, this is when I would set goals and help them set goals for the new year. So once again, on the intake forms or on the examination forms, has an area where they fill out their short-term goals and their long-term goals. Now, this would be at a comparative examination at an end of year versus just a progress examination. And as I follow up with them, a lot of people will say things like, I want to lose 10 pounds, or, I'd like to, lose 10 pounds is probably one of the most common ones. I'd like to have more energy. So sometimes they can be goals that are, wonderful for them to be able to attain in the future, but I can get in there and I can get them really focused on some objectives that are tied to those goals. So I want to lose 10 pounds. Great. What's your plan? How are you going to do that? Oh, well, I haven't really thought about that. That's my goal. I want to lose 10 pounds. Okay, great. Let's come up with a plan. For us, we have the Underground Fit Club. We have Charlie's Cafe. So we have other components that I want to guide people into and give them access to those other areas. For you, maybe it's, affiliations that you have with people in your community, whether it's a fitness center, a gym, a restaurant, nutritional coaching, things that are outside your practice. And we advise that they're outside your practice. And you can connect people to that. But this leads me to number 7, and I think maybe, along with number 1, one of the most important components, and that's accountability. But let me just put a spin on accountability for you. When we get people to set goals, especially around Eat, Move, and Think by Design, the nice thing is that we're essentially detaching them from the need for chiropractic to be the only solution. I'm on board that corrective care, that checking and correcting subluxations is a complete game changer for people's health, their physiology, and their life. Absolutely. 100%. But I don't want that responsibility and I don't want that pressure of people thinking that I'm the only person that can help them. And I think that many docs think this is the way to go, and it makes them feel good and it pumps up their ego. And on the front end, it can feel great because people really look at you and they give all the credit to chiropractic and they give all the credit to your practice and you, and it's great. But at some point, that's going to peter out. Those people who've been getting checked every week or every 14 days for 10, 15 years, they love you. They love coming to you. They value your care for the most part. But, they're not celebrating you because correcting the subluxation pattern and keeping them in an optimization stage is not yielding the subjective results like it once did. When you're at 90% function, you go from 90 to 90.1, the experience of that is, very minimal. You don't really, from a subjective standpoint anyway, you really don't get a sense of that change. But if you took somebody from 40 to 50% or 40 to 45 or 41% even, it would be a drastic change. So we need to start to shift them onto other things that they can be doing and making the central part, which is you and your checkups and your correction, that should just become a no-brainer. Right? It's just something that people do. It's never even in question anymore. Here's your test. Here's where you're at. Here's your goals for this year. Great. Based on your tests, based on your goals, this is the best checkup schedule for you. Does that work for you? Yes, it does. Great. Come to an agreement on finances. Away you go. But what we want to do is we want to use this as an accountability tool to connect them to other things. So, again, I keep coming back to Eat, Move, and Think by Design, but for you, it might be other things that you tend to direct people towards, you think are important in people's health. Here's an opportunity to have that conversation. How you doing with your Eat by Design steps? There's 10 steps. How many of those do you think you've integrated in? Well, only 3. Great. Well, let's focus on this one this year. How about eat more fat? Yeah, let's do that. Great. So every meal you're going to focus on adding a good fat into your meal. Can you do that? Yes. Perfect. So I'm going to hold you accountable to that. Their mindset now is on, in addition to getting checked, it's on eating more fat or better sources of fat, which we know is going to improve their body's function. It's going to improve the function of their nervous system. It's going to make you look great because you're helping them add something else that they need to be doing that supports what you do. It's not this separate, thing over here. It's not about, hey, I got to get you some orthotics or I need to sell you on some other program. It's really still tied into your core product, if you will. But you're also not taking away, your job. It's staying front and center. It's staying, really at the core. It's on the stage still for people to be, part of. They're, looking forward to coming to their next checkup. And I think that what happens is we assume that if we have other conversations and we direct people into these other areas, that suddenly they're going to think that, I guess we're not that important anymore, and they're going to lose focus, they're going to lose value, and eventually they're going to drop out and they're going to stop coming into a practice. And that leads us back, full circle to why people don't do the progress examinations or the re-examinations or have a feedback cycle in the first place. It's because they're afraid. They're afraid people are going to leave. They're afraid they can't communicate it properly. And, the key component that I'll leave you guys with is that you're missing an incredible opportunity. It's not about being scared that they're going to leave. This is your opportunity to check in with them, to manage their expectations, to guide their process, to set goals, to build an objective checkup-based practice. And if you don't do them already, making sure you have feedback cycles, progress examinations, re-examinations, and the reviews that go with them in place is one of the most vital key components that you can have to building a successful retention-based third paradigm chiropractic practice. Thank you guys for listening into the show. If you have any questions, by all means, go to the website, lifebydesignforchiropractors.com. Share this podcast with other chiropractors. There's so many people in the profession who could use it, and we'd love to get it out to them. This is Dr. Jamie Richards, your host, Life by Design for Chiropractors, the voice of reason in chiropractic.